examine the origins of racism within the U.S.'s healthcare system and how it continues to impact us today. Since its founding, the United States healthcare system has been shaped by and benefited from institutional racism. According to Owens, during the era of slavery in America, doctors would use slaves as test subjects in brutal experiments and autopsies. These practices began because Black people were seen as a commodity that could be easily exploited in the name of scientific process, and subsequently a large portion of the medical knowledge we have today is built on this. Slave owners also had a stake in the health of their slaves, particularly in the fertility of Black women, as the more children they were able to have, the more resources slave owners were able to produce and sell. Thus, Owens writes that many of the experiments done on Black people were to discover the most efficient way to build capital for enslavers. Developing parallel to the modern medical system during this time period was the concept of race-based medicine. Race-based medicine began as a way to prove that there were mental and physical differences between white and Black people. In their study, Hoffman states these false beliefs were championed by scientists, physicians, and slave owners to justify slavery and the inhumane treatment of Black men and women in medical research. In other words, concocting fantastical myths about human biology made it easier for white people to excuse and profit from slavery. Though these dangerous myths and practices have been condemned and disproven, their effects linger. And there's no more of an infamous example of these lingering effects than the Tuskegee Experiments as pictured here. The Tuskegee Institute was a hospital in Alabama that experimented on impoverished Black men with syphilis from 1932 to 1972. Alston outlined that this study took place to trace the course of untreated syphilis in Black men. Since a majority of the 600 recruits were poor and illiterate, the Tuskegee Institute was able to trick them into thinking they were receiving viable care. In actuality, the only treatment the men received was the diagnosis of bad blood, despite penicillin having been identified as a treatment for syphilis by the 1940s. The leaking of the experiments to the press in 1972 rocked both the medical and Black communities, and to this day has caused irreparable damage to the relationship between the two. Despite what the Tuskegee Institute said, this study was not about scientific research into the progression of a disease. The Tuskegee experiment was a continuation of the medical community's obsession with proving that Black people are less than human at best and covert genocide at worst. Though the era of legitimized racial medicine and the Tuskegee experiments are in the past, their effects still linger. In the study I mentioned earlier, Hoffman explained that racial stereotypes may cause doctors to not realize or believe the level of pain Black patients are in. Hoffman conducted 2 surveys, one on non-physician white people and one on medical students and residents. These surveys asked them to rate a list of biological differences between Black and white people as true, untrue, as seen here. The results were truly disheartening. They found that 73% of non-physician white people subscribed to at least one false racial belief, as did 50% of medical students. Furthermore, they found that the more false beliefs a medical student or resident had about biological differences between races, the more likely they were to rate Black people as feeling less pain. These findings just highlight the need for more widespread discussion of implicit bias, because doctors often can cause or worsen the problems they try to treat. Now that I've walked through the past and present of racism within our healthcare system, I would like to introduce 3 foundational studies that helped inform and shape the research I chose to conduct. In the current body of knowledge, the psychological and physical effects of racism are usually only discussed for adults. However, ethnic identity is a major part of development in children and shapes the way they perceive themselves and others for the rest of their lives. Allen states that most children end up redefining and changing their perception of the racial group from negative to positive as they get older. These outcomes are associated with high group self-esteem, and whenever children first become aware of their race and notice how they are treated by others because of it, this developmental process begins. In their foundational study, Allen surveyed 2 groups of students, children transitioning from elementary to middle school and children transitioning from middle to high school. They found that group esteem rose among both groups, identity exploration rose just among the older students, and that specifically Black and Latino children showed a dynamic amount of change in group esteem in 3 years. This is likely because older children possess better introspection and abstract thinking skills, as well as have more social awareness. Another overlooked perspective in academia is how implicit bias and racism in the healthcare system affects children and their parents. According to Auslander, parent satisfaction with their healthcare provider is a salient indicator of medical outcomes and compliance, and is heavily impacted by perceived bias among parents and children. Auslander surveyed mothers and their children who had been diagnosed with diabetes on their satisfaction with medical care, family and neighborhood stressors, perceptions of racism, etc. They found that the more racism mothers experienced in and outside of medical care, the more likely they were to feel dissatisfied satisfied with their child's medical care. Both the historical and the foundational studies I just discussed has given me an idea of the way the U.S.'s healthcare system interacts with people of color and what problems still linger in the present era. The body of literature has led me to ask, what are the perceptions of white and black parents of middle school students on access to healthcare? As our current body of research stands, several trends and theories have been established. For instance, the fact that racism has a physical long-term effect on the human body. Even so, I noticed that a portion of the research I mentioned before, while crucial to the understanding of racial identity within healthcare, is not current and may not be accurate in the present. Specifically, the research done on children, parents, and doctors is outdated. I decided to both expand on these studies and gather data to deduce whether the results have changed since the 1990s. Based on the context given by my foundational sources, I chose to focus on parents of children ages 11 to 14, the majority of which ended up being located in Kansas City, Missouri. Participants were selected to be in the study using convenient sampling. Now, onto the development of the survey questions I used. I used SurveyMonkey Advantage to create and distribute my survey, which is a third-party service that safeguards all data collected, which is then deleted after 5 years. Participation in the survey was completely voluntary, the only incentive being a copy of the results when they were completed. Before starting the survey, participants had to read and agree to an online consent form. I based my survey on the questions in the SLATES survey. My survey was made up of 9 questions, not counting basic demographic and healthcare information, and each utilized a forced Likert scale. In my survey, I formatted the Likert scales to have the participants read the statement and, based on their feelings, choose between strongly agree, disagree, and strongly disagree. As stated earlier, the survey was disseminated to parents of 6th, 7th, and 8th graders during March of 2021 via Facebook groups, Reddit, and by word of mouth. I chose to use a mixed methods approach to conduct the survey. The questions using the forced Likert scale asked about the parents' level of trust and comfort they felt with their child's doctor, if they felt as if the doctor listened to both of them and their child, and if they felt like their child's doctor cared about their child's well-being. Then they had the option to elaborate via the short answer section after each question. Next, onto the results of my survey. The survey yielded a total of 84 responses. However, 21 of the surveys were not completed, causing me to exclude them from the final analysis. This could be due to participant or technology error, as well as the participant choosing not to complete the survey. The remaining viable data totaled to 63 responses. Of the 63 participants, a majority were white women with white sons. The remaining respondents and their children were Black African American, Asian or Asian American, and Hispanic or Latino. Next, the participants were asked about their healthcare information. A majority of the parents reported their child had a primary healthcare provider, and a handful of them did not. However, when prompted to report whether their child receives healthcare if they did not have a primary provider, 24 parents answered this question when only 3 had originally said that their child did not have a primary healthcare provider. I believe this could be because the respondents misunderstood the wording of the question. Despite this, parents responded they received healthcare via urgent care centers and walk-in clinics, such as in Hy-Vee or Walgreens. When asked about their child's healthcare provider, the respondents reported about an equal ratio of male and female healthcare providers. When asked to best describe their child's healthcare provider's race or ethnicity, most said white, while others responded Asian or Asian American, Black or African American, Pacific Islander, and multiracial. The 9 Likert scale statements asked in the survey yielded results in the form of bar graphs, which I will display as figures 1, 2, and 3. I chose to categorize the graphs into 3 sections by subject of statement: general practices, parental input, and parental healthcare provider relationships. General practices refers to statements that discuss acts or decisions that are considered a required part of a doctor's visit. Figure 1 shows the result of statement 14, my child's healthcare provider spends the right amount of time in the room with my child and I. As shown here, a majority of the parent respondents agreed with the statement at 98.41%. Next, we have the parental input category, which refers to the interactions that parents have with their child's healthcare provider and the way the healthcare provider responds to them and considers their feelings and opinions. Figure 2 shows data for statement 18. My child's healthcare provider takes all my concerns and questions seriously. Based on figure 3, 95.24% of the respondents agreed, while 4.76% disagreed. Finally, the third category. Parental healthcare provider relationship refers to the strength of the trust, respect, and overall dynamic between a child's healthcare provider and their parents. Figure 3 refers to statement 26. child's healthcare provider sincerely cares about my child's physical, emotional, and mental well-being. As in figure 2, 95.24% agreed and 4.76% disagreed. I've gone over some of the results of the quantitative section, so now onto the results of the qualitative short answer section. Many parents chose not to respond to these questions, but among the ones that did, I chose to code their responses based on positive or negative words or phrases used. I then chose to further organize responses into words or phrases pertaining to personality attributes and perceived competence of the healthcare provider within the negative and positive categories. I coded for 22 words or phrases, which were used a total of 51 times. Positive personality attributes refers to words or phrases respondents use to describe something beneficial about the healthcare provider's mannerisms that help the interaction run smoothly. For instance, on one question, a parent said of their child's doctor that she is always speaking from a caring place and makes my kids feel safe. Another said that they've been taking their daughter to the same pediatrician since she was born and that they trust her implicitly. These words were included in 29% of positive responses and in 18% of all responses. Positive perceived competence codes for responses that positively commented on professional attributes of their child's healthcare provider or discussed a high level of competence they perceived during the visit. According to one respondent, their child's doctor always takes a minute to talk to my child alone in case there is ever a concern they wouldn't want to see in front of me. Additionally, another parent said the healthcare provider was open to listening to their concerns. These words were included in 71% of positive responses and in 43% of all responses. I chose to categorize all interactions parents shared where they perceived racism or any other type of discrimination from their child's healthcare provider as negative personality attributes. While this is a slight deviation from the reasoning behind the other categories, I believe that it is the best way to highlight the range in negative responses. One parent said about their child's healthcare provider, "I don't think he cares, to be honest." Interestingly, one parent answered that she specifically chose the children's doctor because she is a woman of color. I know there is bias in some white healthcare professionals, so I avoid them. These words were included in 67% of negative responses and in 12% of all responses. Finally, negative perceived competence refers to responses that negatively commented on professional attributes of their child's healthcare provider or discussed a low level of competence they perceived during the visit. One parent wrote that they asked their child's healthcare provider about eating habits and got blown off, and another said that they don't feel she respects their time by staying on schedule. It's really frustrating and annoying about their child's doctor. These words were included in 33% of negative responses and in 5% of responses overall. Now the results I just analyzed will be discussed and reframed around the research question. What are the perceptions of white and black parents of middle school students on access to healthcare? Most of the participants who participated in the survey were white women. This is despite the several ways I attempted outreach to black parents with little success. A possible cause of this lack of interest is the medical distress within the black community caused by the historical medical racism discussed before. Black parents may be more uncomfortable answering and discussing topics within my survey, especially with someone they don't know personally, and therefore do not know the intentions of using personal information they would be sharing are. In both the quantitative and qualitative results, positive experiences were most common among the responding parents. In all the graphs present within the study, the agree and strongly agree categories were by far the most commonly chosen option in responding to the statements, and the results of the short answer section were much of the same. This suggests that a majority of parents have positive experiences with their child's healthcare provider. However, it must be pointed out that because most of the participants were white, this could have skewed the data in the positive direction. Just because the good experiences were more common does not make the negative ones any less important or impactful. According to the graph data, only a handful of parents responded disagree or strongly disagree, making their experiences a part of the minority. Overall, among the negative responses, a clear narrative was formed about the parents' interaction with their child's healthcare provider. This difference is highlighted specifically within the responses mentioned before. We trust her implicitly, and I specifically choose the children's doctor because she's a woman of color. The gap in trust in both individual doctors and the system as a whole is stark between these two parents. These responses could suggest that black parents are aware of the biases within the healthcare system and do their best to navigate through them in order to get the best care possible for their child. Although I set out to make my research as objective as possible, there are some limitations I must acknowledge. First, the sample size of the respondents is a limiting factor in multiple ways. While there was no location restraint on the research, most of the parents who responded to the survey came from the Kansas City, Missouri area due to my use of convenient sampling. Despite my best efforts, a majority of the participants were also white, which may tie back to the widespread medical distrust among the Black community. Finally, I noticed that some parents may have misunderstood the wording of questions 8 and 9 in the survey, which asked about whether or not the child had a primary health care provider, and if not, where they receive health care, because more of them responded to the latter question than the former. Because of this, I must acknowledge that a similar outcome might have happened in other questions and statements, and the data may not be accurate to the actual experiences of parent respondents. Limitations can also stem areas of future research which must be done in order to get a full understanding of the nuances that come with race in healthcare. Through the study, I was able to establish opinions and experiences of some parents with their child's healthcare provider, but there are several other aspects and factors within the situation that should be researched further. For example, I chose to limit my survey to parents with children ages 11 to 14, so in the future a wider range of children should be included. Furthermore, the study did not account for the fact that gender had on interactions between healthcare providers and parents, and should be a factor considered in future research. Now that I've taken the time to analyze and discuss my findings, a few implications must be discussed. The most pressing one being that despite positive experiences parents had with their child's healthcare provider far outweighed negative feelings and experiences, the latter was still just as, if not more salient, to understanding the relationship between race and healthcare. In fact, the lack of responses from parents of color in and of itself speaks volumes on the state of that relationship. Medical mistrust and racism is still present and sewn deep into the U.S.'s healthcare system. And without serious reforms or a complete overhaul of the system at large, these disparities will continue. Thank you for coming to my presentation, and I look forward to answering any questions you have for me.
How did your initial exploration of the scholarly conversation lead to your final research question or your project goal?
Well, I actually did research on racism in healthcare in my AP seminar research last year. So I had that basis going in AP research. As I dug into the body of knowledge, I noticed a trend of different groups, such as women and children of color, being further marginalized because of age and gender. This helped me hone in on a research question and gap.
What are the real-world implications or consequences related to your findings?
I think one real-world implication is that through my research, it seems like the medical mistrust within the Black community established in the body of knowledge seems to have been upheld, as it was difficult to find ways to disseminate my study diversely.
Think back to the initial curiosity that sparked your inquiry. What other curiosities do you have, and how has this process prepared you to explore them?
My interest in this research actually began in AP seminar when I investigated race, gender, and healthcare. I'm still interested in the intersections of race, class, gender, and our healthcare system. And my research opened up new critical thinking and further research outlets I wouldn't have thought